But turning to the government's official sort of response, I think sort of Chris Stark at the Committee on Climate Change sort of reflected on this in a tweet yesterday, is that we only sort of received in advance an embargoed press release. And that was the same for me as chair of the Mission Zero Coalition. I didn't have the opportunity to actually see in full the government's response to all 129 recommendations until you yourselves did. What I did see sort of in advance yesterday was a press release that stated that the government was going to take forwards 23 out of the 25 recommendations of the Mission Zero report. And I think it's important to reflect when we look at sort of spin that obviously the Mission Zero report did not make just 25 recommendations. The 25 recommendations that the government are taking forwards 23 of were placed in a framework of 25 key recommendations to be delivered by 2025. As I've stated before, to give the government a helping hand in recognizing sort of limitations, but really to recognize that this needs to happen as soon as possible. Obviously, the wider report made 129 recommendations. And of those recommendations, 77 were for the government to take forwards this year in 2023. See, that the nature of Mission Zero meant that of those 129 recommendations, some of those are for establishing longer term frameworks around the certainty, the consistency, the continuity and clarity of policy frameworks that are required. See, a key argument of the report was about establishing long-term programmatic approaches to net zero across at least a minimum of a 10-year pathway, looking to both Germany with their KfW program for insulation, or now the Inflation Reduction Act in the States, which has the 45Q tax credit guaranteed to the 1st of January 2033. The Mission Zero report very much was to state, why can we not demonstrate that singular sense of purpose across governments, across demonstrating long-term dynamic thinking about how we're going to deliver on a mission? What is the outcome we want to set ourselves? We've set ourselves an NDC for 68% emissions reduction for 2030 and 78% emissions reductions for 2035. Why can't we have the similar policy frameworks that stretch across those timescales in order to demonstrate how we can deliver? But in terms of the overall 129 recommendations, I've done my own sort of analysis now of where I think the government has delivered or not delivered, or maybe might deliver in the future. So of the 129 recommendations, my own sort of judgment is that there are around 53 of those the government has accepted, pretty much accepted in full, and is now taking forwards processes in order to deliver them. And I'm going to touch on some of those in a moment. There are then a mid-range of between about 47 and 49 recommendations, where the government sort of agrees in principle that this is something should happen. They just don't necessarily agree with the Mission Zero's report's methodology of achieving it. So there are a number of areas where, for instance, I talked about how we should have long-term funding structures and frameworks, and that there should be long-term funding design with a ministerial champion. And the government has said with those recommendations that that is a question for the next spending review. So again, a bit of a teaser, but then also agreeing in principle, saying we do agree that we need long-term funding structures, giving examples like Great British Nuclear as an example of where they're actually beginning to set up these long-term institutional approaches, but not absolutely agreeing to 100% take forward the recommendation. And then there are the sort of simple no disagreement sort of will not be taking forward sort of bracket. And I've got around between 27 and 29 of the policy recommendations in the Mission Zero review, the government has stated they will not be taking forwards. And I will be reflecting on that in a moment. You may remember with the Mission Zero report, what I tried to do also was bracket it up into 6 pillars that were going to effectively strengthen the foundations of net zero. And I thought it'd be helpful actually just to quickly go through effectively the recommendations in the pillars as a means of saying this is what the government has taken forwards, what the potentially going to take forwards, where I see there as to be a sort of positive news opportunity, and also potentially a criticism of where I think the government has missed the boat. So the first pillar obviously was securing net zero, thinking about those overarching delivery mechanisms, funding mechanisms, about how you build out capability, capacity, so infrastructure, grid, getting the basics right. And critical, obviously, to that in the report was an Office for Net Zero Delivery, recommendation 7. Now, the government, as I feared, have decided not to take that forward. There will be no Office of Net Zero Delivery that will be overarching across departments. They simply claim that having the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero is job done. And I think that is regrettable, because actually when you look at some of the other recommendations where actually an Office of Net Zero Delivery would provide the accountability to drive forwards change and hold departments' feet for the fire. If you looked at recommendation 11, where we talked about ensuring that there were climate impacts of future spending reviews and climate impacts were taken account of in future fiscal decision making, the government's response is simply that the government departments are ultimately responsible for assessing the impacts of their programs. So now we return to the chicken and egg scenario of departments, everyone finger pointing at each other, which is regrettable, because an Office of Net Zero Delivery would have helped drive forwards impartial and independent frameworks for change. I think in terms of thinking about other recommendations that I sort of picked up on, unfortunately, when it came to looking at accountability mechanisms, also there was a sort of, they won't be taking forwards a net zero charter mark. There's a number of sort of recommendations that are looking at sort of potentially a transition taxonomy, potentially taking up international sustainability standards boards, frameworks for adoptions. This is all sort of good news, but again, no overarching sort of narrative framework of demonstrating what's the best in class. There's a huge appetite for businesses to know what they need to achieve and how they can work towards that and have confidence that what they are doing is the right thing. And obviously the green finance strategy, the new sort of freshly launched strategy yesterday, is a step forwards, but doesn't provide the clarity. Again, another key recommendation in infrastructure, grid and capacity that hasn't been taken forwards is a net zero remit for Ofgem, a simple no from the government. So again, another key ask, which I would be tempted to say members of Parliament will be returning to the Energy Security Bill committee stage in the Commons in May, and I imagine this will be a key amendment that might be sort of forced upon the government. One area I think of infrastructure challenge that was welcome and actually did sort of surprise me was actually around gas and electricity rebalancing. Sort of gripping this is essential, as we all know, for delivering on decarbonising heat in industry and in buildings and in homes. Unless we can drive down the costs of electricity and demonstrate the economic value of the change, it's not going to happen. So making sure that that sort of took place, and the government has said by the end of 2024, I think was for me probably one of the most positive recommendations the government has taken forwards. I think also when it comes now to looking at sort of deployment of powering net zero, that second pillar that I set out in the review, obviously when it comes to looking at planning, when it comes to looking at sort of how to unblock some of those delays, it's a mixed bag. We've got sort of essentially a commitment to an action plan that is going to be consulting on energy national policy statements. But when I asked in recommendation 28 for clear guidance on case-by-case decisions, there is a refusal to do so. But also when it comes to looking at the actual sort of deployment of renewable and clean power, obviously the announcements on nuclear, on CCUS sort of grabbed the headlines. But we had an announcement of a task force for solar, which again was extremely welcome and sort of sets up quite nicely now this coalescing mission around how we achieve 70 gigawatts of solar by 2035. Also, I think sort of hidden away in that government response to recommendation 26 was, I think, quite a key line, which was that we confirm we are not making changes to agricultural land that might constrain solar deployment. Don't think that's necessarily been picked up, but obviously politically there was that challenge around certain MPs claiming that all this wonderful land that was producing beautiful crops was somehow being taken up by solar panels and being wasted, and obviously that is a false narrative. Hopefully the land use strategy that has also been one of the recommendations that's been accepted, that the government has also agreed in advance of the Mission Zero report, will be able to slay the myth that actually somehow there is a choice between solar farms and agricultural land. There is enough land to be able to deliver both, but we need to effectively demonstrate where we can create sustainable projects on both sides. Unfortunately, however, there was no agreement by the government to take forward a onshore wind task force, a simple no. So this really opens a question about what is the government's ambition, obviously, for onshore wind for the future. The Mission Zero report was clear that the recommendations received to us suggested 30 gigawatts by 2030, 35 gigawatts by 2035. But this is a hokey-cokey approach to onshore wind, because on the one hand, there is an acceptation, 1 foot in is that communities, there'll be a consultation of what future community engagement will look like and how to support that. But there is no driving overarching strategy for actually the future deployment. So we will need to see now what will happen again in the energy security bill when it comes to looking at community consent, and also potentially how we can highlight the opportunity for onshore wind and where this fits in more broadly to the energy mix. As I said, I won't go through some of the issues around hydrogen and CCUS, apart from to say, when you look at powering up Britain, if you do a word analysis of the Powering Up Britain document, you'll see that hydrogen is mentioned 114 times, wind is mentioned 30 times, solar is mentioned 14 times, and batteries are mentioned 4 times. And that, I think, is quite indicative of, obviously, a prioritization of the new department, which is really putting quite a lot of its eggs in industrial decarbonisation, in the technologies of the future that are yet to be fully realised, without recognising the critical importance of the technologies that are already there to be deployed at scale, that we know work and could be operational within several years, not decades. And I think that is indicative of potentially a welcome aspiration in looking at CCUS and hydrogen, but we shouldn't be excluding other technologies and deployment of renewable power in consequence. Thinking then just also about the oil and gas, because I think that was another key concern. We didn't obviously see the granting of any permission for Rosebank or any a licensing, but whether that comes down the track in the next couple of weeks. Minister Stewart, both in the Commons and I think later on in a speech he made at RUSI, was quite strident about obviously energy security and looking at seeing oil and gas and new oil and gas fields as a solution to energy security issues. And I imagine that's going to be a point of strong contention among members of Parliament across both houses, and we will see where that goes. But obviously, when it came to looking at the Mission Zero recommendations around abatement, I was keen to recognise, that there is a role for oil and gas. That when we look at the CCC's balanced pathway, 60% of the oil and gas we use now, will still be in some form of use by 2050. And obviously, I wish that wasn't the case, but that is the world we live in, and we obviously have to recognise the use of oil for petrochemicals and other industries, and while working to decarbonise them and how we create renewable forms of hydrocarbons, which is why the circular economy mission is so important in delivering net zero for the future. But it was striking that while the government lent into saying oil and gas had a role, there was no agreement whatsoever on transparency for oil and gas imports, claiming that the North Sea Transition Authority has no import emission data. There was no agreement, flat out refusal to replace the energy profits levy with a hypothecated net zero fund that I sort of felt would demonstrate if you're BP or if you're Shell, if you really think you're going net zero, put your money where your mouth is and actually demonstrate sort of that you're investing in net zero rather than just sort of, retrofitting your own existing rigs. There was no commitment to Geo Zero, apart from to say that there may be future consideration. There was no acceptation of a 10% CCUS target for 2035. I thought it was quite interesting that the sort of government was particularly sort of strident on sort of protecting the North Sea transition deal without sort of recognising that it's not fit for purpose, as the CCC has already sort of indicated. Going through then into thinking about net zero and the economy, because I can't go through every recommendation. You don't want me to either, I'm pretty sure. I was delighted to see that when it came to taking forwards the challenge around skills, there is going to be a new net zero and nature workforce action plan in 2024. Obviously recognising that the core challenge around skills deployment, if we're going to ensure that any of these sort of sectors are able to be operational, is going to be absolutely critical. But then thinking obviously around some of the issues around net zero and the economy, the third sort of pillar, legislation that the review called for, particularly around EPC standards, although recognising those need to be reformed, it wasn't accepted. So when it came to looking, for instance, at legislating by 2025 for EPC B in all commercial properties, it's not necessarily that challenging. 85% of all commercial properties are EPC B, so why we couldn't get to 100% in the next couple of years, I think is an ambition that's relatively modest, but again, a no to that. Also, a no to creating a plastics export ban by 2027, stating obviously that they need to understand that they simply just believe that we should be working more with OECD countries around sort of future recycling of plastics internationally. A no to I wanted the government to look at how they can create public procurement standards to drive sustainable market supply chains. Again, the government's in a strong place, being the largest procurer of steel, of cement, to be able to drive this change forwards. Again, a no to that. Working to understand the challenges, need to understand these better in the round was the response. So again, a sort of limit on the ambition there around some of the sectoral opportunities. Obviously, there were sort of positive opportunities around the green finance strategy, around the CBAM consultation, around the energy efficiency task force that was seen as being given as a solution to some of the recommendations. Obviously, we don't know what the energy efficiency task force is going to recommend, so that's why I often put these in a sort of like a maybe box rather than a definitely. But I think when we look at taking forwards then the local agenda, pillar 4, again, a limit of ambition. Part of the net zero review and obviously the local mission zero network that we're setting up is really to understand how we can turbocharge net zero by creating the opportunities, the funding opportunities, the frameworks by which local and regional actors are able to be given greater control and certainty over their net zero journeys is a key part of delivering on the Mission Zero report, recognizing the vital nature of a place-based approach. But when we look at the government's response to that, there is an agreement that they will explore a simplification of funding, but doesn't necessarily extend beyond the net zero strategy in 2021, which made similar noises. Core principles around net zero devolution. I thought this was interesting, potentially promising. It says the government is open to exploring establishing a set of principles for future deals on net zero devolution. So I think that does provide a coalescing opportunity for the network to look at what these principles might be. And I'll be very keen to explore that in the network. Unfortunately, it was a no to bringing forward a net zero trailblazer city by 2030. I still think, actually, when we look at sort of 3CI and the 40 Cities project, probably they'll get on with it even without government support. But it would have been nice for the UK government to be able to demonstrate that they were the first country to commit to their first city going net zero by 2030. Again, some of these opportunities won't come again. And if you miss them now, you miss them. So there we are. In terms of then thinking through other recommendations, yeah, I called for a local climate summit that would explore how to deliver through local determined contributions. The government has said they think that is already being met by the Association for Public Service Excellence, bringing forwards a coalesce. And maybe that, I haven't met with the Association of Public Service Excellence, so maybe they're doing a fantastic job in bringing local authorities together. But the recommendation was to really think about almost how you create a UK COP for local authorities, where they can come annually or with data to be able to demonstrate the changes that they've made. So there's a slight sort of misinterpretation, I think, from the government's part on that. In terms of then thinking about the guidance and the data, the government's really leaning into the local net zero hubs for the future. So a lot of hope is being pinned on those. And I think it's worth exploring in the network about, are the hubs actually sort of delivering in the way that the government hope they will? What additional sort of infrastructure and support the hubs will need? It looks like the government are going down this sort of route of the hubs for demonstrating sort of their local action for the future. Again, sort of disappointing, maybe not surprising, government flat out rejecting any implementation of a local electricity bill. Time and time again, every sort of community group that I spoke to recognises the importance of the local electricity bill in supporting local community energy. And I think we still need to push on recognising that this isn't just a nice to have. This isn't just about ensuring it's empowering local communities. It's actually critical for understanding how we can reimagine the future of our energy and electricity generation. So sort of, that again was disappointing. In terms of then the planning issues around MPPF, reforming MPPF, looking at sort of delivering on bottlenecks at a local level, there is going to be the nationally significant infrastructure project plan. There is talk around neighbourhood priority statements in the Levelling Up bill that's still to sort of see its full passage through the Commons. So again, I'm expecting potential amendment opportunities there. But again, no real sense of the scale of the challenge around how to deliver net zero through the existing planning system, which isn't fit for purpose, and how to move forwards with that. We've seen that consultation, I said, announced, and so we'll see what that might bring. But there seems to be a limitation of ambition. Thinking then just really quickly, because I'm keen to see whether Philip is on the call and get Philip's reflection. Also, when it came to buildings and net zero and the individual householder, obviously this is always the one that the media wants to focus on the most. I think for myself, again, thinking about rebalancing gas and electricity, really positive for me. One of the big sort of takeaway commitments. There was a bit of focus in the media saying, well, they haven't accepted the 2033 target for gas boiler removal, or no new gas boilers for 2033, which we move forward from 2035. Actually, that's not the case. That was sort of spun, I think, to the Sun and the Telegraph. When you read the fine print by the government, they say they will further consider the 2033 target. So there is a sort of potential, and they will also consider implications for a 2033 target for other gas appliances. Obviously, I was keen to demonstrate that we should move to gas-free homes by 2033. So interesting that the government, is maybe briefing out saying that they're not doing the 2033 target, but actually, when we look at their long-term trajectory, it's still in the mix. And I think it's so vital potentially for understanding how we can make net zero more affordable. We ran a distributional analysis tool for net zero that was created for the review. And one of the recommendations was that this distribution analysis tool was now going to be taken up by government and used in future. And that was a recommendation the government has accepted. But that distribution analysis tool showed that moving the date from 2035 to 2033 actually made the opportunity to deliver heat pumps more affordable. It's scaled up the industry in the same way the ZEV mandate is making sort of industry wake up and recognise what needs to happen within a decade, lowering the labour market sort of costs, building up skill supply chains, bringing down the learning costs of technology. And in terms of obviously a challenge around energy efficiency, which was picked up on, is that there's no real new money. Yeah, if we're going to have a national retrofit strategy, 300,000 extra homes being brought into scope, understanding that sort of Echo Plus is going to be called a great British energy efficiency scheme, in a way is sort of welcome, and maybe that might be a sort of like opening in a door for a wider sense of a programme where more money may come later on in the spending review. And obviously that Jeremy Hunt set out, he wants to set out a fuller response to the Inflation Reduction Act come the spending review in the autumn. But obviously, there is a window of opportunity now for us to move as fast as possible. And sooner, the more we delay, the further we kick the can down the road. And that 600,000 target by 2028 looks increasingly out of reach if we're simply going to not put up the level of investment that is required. And in terms of skills, there is a decarbonisation skills training competition, which was in response to the heat pump retraining recommendation, 119, but 9.2 million pounds is not going to train a new army of heat pump engineers to fit some heat pumps or construct these for the future. And then just thinking about finally the net zero and the future, we've had a sort of agreement that they will potentially look on a consultation for the voluntary carbon markets for the future. Unfortunately, however, the last recommendation taking forward a strategic review of our leadership on climate change, what that might mean internationally, again, that is a no. We no longer have, obviously, Alex Sharma in place. I don't think we even have a special climate envoy in the Foreign Office since Nick Bridge's sort of departure. So there is a key question around what is sort of future UK climate leadership. So that in itself poses a challenge, because many of these issues that we want to focus on should not be just UK focused issues. We should be thinking about how these solutions that we want to build out can be then amplified globally, and we can only really sort of do that if we recognise that both the global and the national challenges go side by side. So in terms of the overall narrative, as I said, 53 recommendations that have come through. Effectively almost 100 that there is a sort of agreement broadly with around 27, 29 no's. Unfortunately, those 27 to 29 no's are some of the key ones that would help us deliver on net zero for the future. So now, obviously, I'm keen to focus on the next stage of the work I want to take forwards, which is both in Parliament with the Energy Security Bill. It'd be interesting to get sort of a discussion going about where you feel key amendments might be for that. And then obviously the Mission Zero networks, which I'll talk about just at the end of this discussion about the meetings that will be happening. As I said, their first ones will be on local buildings, industry, and then solar. And I think that what we've got from the government in terms of recommendations, but also in terms of potential opportunities for future consultations or explorations, give those networks quite a good opportunity to position themselves as trying to sort of work to deliver on future policy frameworks for that. I'm going to see if Philip Dunn is sitting in the waiting room at all. Philip, are you on the call? Sure if Philip is there. I don't know.
Yes, check. Chris, I am. I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yes, thank you so much for joining, Philip. I really do appreciate it. Did you want to give some of your reflections as chair of the Environmental Audit Committee on yesterday, and any broader things that you'd like to get across to the session?
Well, thank you, Chris, for giving me this opportunity. I have to say I have not been in the country since Wednesday evening, so I've not had the opportunity to review the over 2,800 pages of government response to your report. I just really like to say first of all, a huge congratulations to you for the incredible work that you've done. I think you had over 50 roundtables, had submissions from 1,800 organisations and individuals, and many of whom are on this call, and for the clarity which you brought to your recommendations. You've just summarised the top line: over 50 accepted, but over 100 not fully accepted. I think some of your proposals were touching on the over-ambitious, so I'm not surprised the government hasn't accepted them all. But I think the general tone, as far as I can tell, of the government response is that it's positive in terms of moving forward somewhat from last September, when your report was initially commissioned. That the government is making some positive noises with, at this point, relatively few fresh recommendations. It seems there's quite a lot of this is what we are doing already by way of response, rather than these are additional things we're going to do, other than in some areas, as you've highlighted. I think the challenge for us all now is to focus on the autumn statement. The Chancellor, both in his budget statement, as you've just said, indicated he'll be responding to the Inflation Reduction Act and the EU measures in the autumn. He reiterated that to the Treasury Select Committee this week. And I think that becomes the main focus of where we're going to be able to get future government commitments backed by funding where required, in order to move this agenda forward significantly. We as a committee will be inviting the Secretary of State and the Energy Minister to come and respond to us in relation to this package of measures. We had a response to our report accelerating the transition from fossil fuels and energy security a couple of weeks ago, which was really an interim holding response. It didn't really move us forward at all. I think because of this pending response to your report and the net zero strategy, now that we've got it, I think we'll take the opportunity to question them. And if people on the call have got points they'd like us to highlight, we'd also, as usual, be very interested in hearing them. So I think that all I would say, just by way of summary, is I think this is a steady as she goes moment, but I think we should recognise that the government has expressed its enthusiasm to take forward a number of these measures, but as often the case, not with the urgency or pace that many of us would have preferred. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm afraid I'm in an airport. You can probably hear that, so I'm going to turn off my mute button.
Well, thank you, Philip, and thanks for that sort of observation. And I know you wrote to the Grant Shapps, sort of saying that his response wasn't up to scratch, and would he come back? And I assume you'll be hoping that sort of Minister Shapps will be back around the table. Do you think, just one question, because I wanted to ask around the EAC committee. Obviously, there's going to be this establishment now, because DESNZ has got a new department. It's having a new select committee established, and I saw that the sort of chairmanship for that is going to be held by the Scottish National Party, and already some candidates have come forwards, and I think the elections are going to be when we return on the 20th of April or 24th of April. Will that mean that, do you think you'll still be able to hold to account the department, or will they sort of be able to palm you off and say, well, we're going to have to go to this new select committee for energy security and net zero? Will you be confident that sort of with the EAC, because you have this overarching opportunity to focus on everything from the environment to obviously delivering on litigation, that you'll still be able to make sure that you can hold DESNZ to account, and they won't just say, oh, we need to talk to the other committee?
Well, on that, I think you're right to raise it, and it's something that I will clearly be taking up with the new chairman of the new committee. But I frankly don't see any real reason to change the arrangements that we've had hitherto in this Parliament, where the previous Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee, chaired by Darren Jones, worked closely with us in aligning what we did. We, members of our committee, were able to guest on their inquiries and vice versa. As long as we don't duplicate and do precisely the same as each other. I see no reason for our committee, which you're an important member of, Chris, to continue to have our wide-ranging ability to scrutinise government policy across environment policy. And I think it's highly unlikely that we will find whichever the Scottish National Party elects as chair, that we will that they will seek to take a more proprietorial approach.
Thank you. Well, Philip, I really appreciate you joining today. I know you are in the airport lounge, so if you need to drop off the call, please do so. But really grateful for you giving your observations as well today, this morning.